I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
There are very few ideas powerful enough to shape an entire country without ever being written into law. They don't appear in the Constitution. They aren't voted on in Congress. Nobody announces them from a podium. Yet they quietly influence the decisions of millions of people every single day. For more than half a century, America has lived by one of those ideas. Study hard, find a good job, work for 40 years. Save your money, and one day, you'll never have to work again. It's such a familiar idea that we rarely question it. Children grow up watching their parents prepare for it. Financial advisors build careers around it. Entire television channels, retirement communities, investment firms, cruise lines, healthcare providers, and insurance companies exist because of it.
Well, and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which you are about to enter, so help you God.
Retirement isn't simply something Americans hope for. It's the final chapter of the American dream. Or at least, it's supposed to be. Lately, though, something has felt different. Almost every week, another headline appears. More Americans are delaying retirement. Older workers are returning to jobs they thought they had left forever. Companies are employing record numbers of people over 65. Polls consistently show growing anxiety about retirement, even among people approaching it. At first glance, the explanation seems obvious. Inflation has pushed prices higher. Housing is more expensive. Healthcare costs continue climbing. Maybe retirement itself has simply become unaffordable. That was certainly my assumption. But assumptions have a habit of falling apart the moment you start following the evidence. So I started where most people probably would. I looked at money. Surely this was just a savings problem. Maybe Americans weren't putting enough aside. Every financial expert seems to repeat the same advice. Save earlier, invest more, spend less. If millions of people are worried about retirement, perhaps millions of people simply failed to prepare for it. The more I looked, however, the stranger that explanation became. Because I kept finding people who had done almost everything right. They had worked continuously for decades. They had paid into retirement accounts. They had contributed to Social Security their entire careers. Many owned their homes. Some even had pensions. Yet they were asking exactly the same question as everyone else. Can I actually afford to retire? That shouldn't happen. If people who ignored financial advice and people who followed it both arrive at the same uncertainty, then perhaps the problem isn't individual. Perhaps the problem is structural. At that point, I stopped looking at retirees. Instead, I started looking at retirement itself, not as a financial goal, as an invention. And that's where the story took a turn I wasn't expecting. For almost all of human history, retirement didn't exist. That sounds almost impossible to believe because retirement feels so natural today. But if you had asked a farmer living 200 years ago when he planned to retire, the question itself would have made very little sense. Farmers worked for as long as they physically could. Blacksmiths continued forging iron until age or illness forced them to stop. Shopkeepers stayed behind the counter well into old age. Most people didn't expect 20 or 30 years of life after work. They expected work to be life. So where did our modern idea come from? At first, I assumed retirement emerged because societies became richer. The Industrial Revolution increased productivity. Factories generated wealth on a scale never seen before. Governments collected more taxes. Businesses expanded rapidly. Surely wealth made retirement possible. It sounded reasonable. Until history complicated the story. Some of the earliest pension systems weren't created because governments suddenly wanted people to enjoy old age. They were created because industrial economies had a practical problem. Older workers couldn't always keep pace with younger ones. Factories wanted efficiency. Railways wanted predictable workforces. Governments needed ways to manage aging civil servants and military veterans. Paying older employees to leave often made economic sense. Retirement wasn't originally sold as freedom. It was sold as workforce management. That completely changed how I viewed the story. What we now celebrate as one of the defining rewards of working life didn't begin as a dream at all. It began as a solution to an economic problem. But then another question emerged. If retirement started as a practical solution for a relatively small number of workers, how did it become something almost every American expects? That answer leads to one of the most consequential laws ever passed in the United States. In 1935, as the country struggled through the Great Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act. Today, it's difficult to imagine American life without it. But at the time, the idea was extraordinary. Workers would contribute throughout their careers, and later in life, those contributions would help provide income when they could no longer work. Notice what the program promised. Not luxury, not vacations, not golf courses, not cruise ships, simply dignity, protection against poverty, a safety net. Yet something fascinating happened over the decades that followed. The program itself didn't change nearly as much as the way Americans began thinking about it. As the economy expanded after World War II, wages rose, suburbs spread across the country, home ownership increased, and employer pensions became increasingly common. Retirement gradually stopped meaning financial survival. It came to represent freedom. The advertisements changed. The expectations changed. Even the language changed. Retirement became the golden years, the years when work finally ended and life truly began. Without anyone officially announcing it, America had quietly rewritten the final chapter of adulthood. Go to school, get a job, build a career, raise a family, retire. For generations, that sequence became so familiar that almost nobody stopped to ask a remarkably simple question. Why did this work so well? Because history teaches us something uncomfortable. Promises don't survive simply because people believe in them. They survive because the conditions that made them possible continue to exist. Every bridge depends on its foundations. Every business depends on customers. Every economy depends on assumptions. So I started asking a different question. Not whether Americans were saving enough, not whether inflation had become too high, not even whether Social Security was running out of money. Those all felt like symptoms. I wanted to know what the entire retirement system depended on in the first place. What invisible foundation had allowed millions of Americans to believe with remarkable confidence that if they worked hard enough, one day they would never have to work again. The answer I would discover wasn't hidden in retirement accounts. It wasn't hidden on Wall Street. It wasn't even hidden inside Social Security. It was hidden inside something far older, far larger, and far more powerful than money itself. And once I understood it, I realized I hadn't been investigating retirement at all. I had been investigating the one assumption upon which the entire modern economy had quietly been built. When I began this investigation, I thought I was looking for money. Retirement has always been framed as a financial problem. Save more, invest earlier, spend less. So if millions of people were struggling to retire, the answer had to be hidden somewhere in bank accounts, pensions, or government budgets. But that theory fell apart the moment I looked beyond America. Japan was facing the same problem. So were Germany, Italy, South Korea, and Canada. Different pension systems, different healthcare systems, different tax laws, yet remarkably similar retirement challenges. That shouldn't have been possible. If every country had built retirement differently, why were they all beginning to crack in the same way? My next theory was globalization. Perhaps the 2008 financial crisis or years of low interest rates had weakened retirement systems everywhere. It sounded plausible until I realized many of these countries had been worrying about retirement long before the financial crisis. The timeline simply didn't fit. So I stopped looking at financial markets and started looking at populations. That's when the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every country facing a retirement crisis was also getting older. People were living longer than ever before, which should have been one of humanity's greatest successes. But longer lives quietly transformed retirement itself. A system originally designed to support people for a relatively short period was now expected to fund 20 or even 30 years after work. For a moment, I thought I'd found the answer. People were living longer. Retirement was simply becoming more expensive. Case closed. Except it wasn't. Another trend kept appearing beside it. People weren't just living longer, they were having fewer children. At first, the connection seemed ridiculous. What could birth rates possibly have to do with retirement? Then I realized I had misunderstood retirement from the very beginning. It was never really built on money. It was built on workers. Every meal a retiree eats, every hospital they visit, every pension payment they receive, every public benefit they rely on, ultimately depends on people who are still working. The retirement system quietly assumes that each new generation entering the workforce will be large enough and productive enough to support the generation leaving it. For much of the 20th century, that assumption held true. America experienced extraordinary population growth, rising productivity, expanding industries, and the enormous baby boom generation entering the workforce. Millions could retire while the economy continued growing because the foundation beneath the promise was exceptionally strong. But foundations change. Birth rates declined. People lived longer. The baby boom generation began retiring. Healthcare costs increased. The mathematics that had supported retirement for decades slowly shifted. Suddenly, headlines that once seemed unrelated began telling the same story. Pressure on Social Security, pension shortfalls, rising healthcare costs, labor shortages, immigration debates, they weren't separate issues at all. They were symptoms of one deeper transformation. That's when I realized I hadn't been investigating a retirement crisis. I had been investigating a demographic one. The most expensive promise America ever made wasn't Social Security, pensions, or Medicare. Those were simply the tools used to keep a much bigger promise alive. The promise that every generation could work for a few decades, retire for a few more, and trust that the generations behind them would make it possible. For much of the last century, that promise worked because history provided extraordinary conditions. Today, those conditions are changing. Which means the real question isn't whether Americans can still retire. It's whether the assumptions that made retirement possible can survive the century that's only just beginning, and if they can't, what promise replaces it?
Today, a hope of many years standing is in large part fulfilled.